Web frames and panels. Extra walnut, extra fun. All right, with our side sub-assemblies not completely done, but done enough, we can move on to the inner framework. So the way these side assemblies are going to come together is with a web frame, 2 of them. In fact, there's a top web frame and a bottom web frame. So that's what we're going to focus on now. That's all going to come from 4/4 material. So I got a mixture of boards here. Most of these parts aren't going to be seen. The rail in the front on the bottom, when you open up the doors, you slide the doors out of the way, you'll be able to see that one, but everything else kind of is just in the shadow on the inside of the case. So if you do have some B stock, you don't have to use your best material for this. You could use stuff with some sapwood. Just keep that front bottom board the nicest board in the bunch, because that's the one you're gonna see. All right, so we're gonna cut these down, get everything cut to final size, and then I'll see you on the other end when we've got some mortises to cut. So the next thing we need to do is cut our web frame pieces to length. Now the longer pieces, as long as we cut them all the same, we could be a little bit off from the plan number and it won't really matter very much. The one that really does matter though is these short guys, right? So we have to be able to make sure, and all the short ones that connect the front and the back of the web frame, those are all the same length, but we got to get that right. Now the plan calls for a number, but this is once again one of those times where we're going to get the information from the project itself. It's way more accurate that way. So I know that I need my web frame to be the same depth as the sides. If they are flush at the front and back, then they just have to match up perfectly. So how are we going to test that? So I don't really care what the actual number here is, right? I just want to make sure it fits. So here's what I recommend you do. Get a little clamp on here, not too much pressure, just the same amount of clamping pressure you'd apply if you were doing the glue up. So we got that nice and secure. And then I'm going to take one of my front rails and one of my rear rails, flush with the leg, flush with the leg here. And the length that I'm going to be cutting those shorter web frame pieces is the distance between these 2 pieces. So I have the perfect fit when I could drop that piece in, press them together, and I'm flush on both ends. And if you want to get real fancy here, you get another clamp and clamp in your piece as you're, sizing it down. And then just feel with your fingers. Oh, that feels pretty good. All right, so this is just one of my test pieces that tells me I do have the measurement that I need, and now I can go ahead and cut the remaining pieces to that same length. All right, so the next thing I recommend you do is lay out your web frame parts. We have lots to do to these web frames from here on out, and you need to keep everything straight because you don't want to put a groove on the wrong side or a rabbet on the wrong face. So what I have organized here, this is my top web frame. This is my bottom. The bottom is going to be the most visible, this bottom front piece. So if you have a nicer piece of material that's not free, a lot of this will be visible when we move the doors, when we look inside. Everything from this point back is a lot less visible. On the front, this top edge will be visible here, but you're not really going to see much else because we're going to have a full-on top that goes on top of this, and then you might be able to see the underside of this front top piece I guess if you get down on your knees or something and you look inside the case, you might see that. So try to keep that edge at the front here looking pretty good. So this will allow you to keep organized, because now we need to cut very specific grooves, like for the sliding doors, and then a rabbet in the back for the back panel. So just however you want to organize it, by writing on there, use blue tape, masking tape to mark the pieces, whatever it takes, that'll keep you organized, right? So the next thing we need to do is cut the grooves and the rabbets. All right, so here at the table saw, I've switched to a 1/2 inch dado stack. That's exactly a 1/2 inch, no shims needed here. And we're gonna put the fence in a position to be 7/16 away from the blade. That's the setback on the front edge. And we'll be able to cut the 2 grooves for our front doors. Only difference between those 2 grooves is gonna be the height of the blade. One's a little bit deeper than the other. All right, so my test piece is looking pretty good. I got the depth I need, and I have the distance in from the edge that I need, so I'm ready to cut my actual work piece here. Notice that I did add these little guys. This is not absolutely necessary, but these are sure nice to have. They will not only provide pressure downward, little spring pressure here, but they also, because of the angle of the rollers, will push me into the fence, and that is not a bad thing when you're doing a long piece like this, and we want that groove to be as consistent as possible. All right, so let's get ready to make the cut. Right now I'm going to make a quick height adjustment, bringing the blade up to 3/8, and I'll run a quick test using the same scrap piece. Got it. All right, so next up, I've changed my setup here by using a sacrificial fence. Part of the fence, or part of the blade, is buried in the fence, leaving us with a 1/4 inch left over, and I got a 1/4 inch blade height. So of course I do a quick test run, everything seems good, and I've got these little stock guides back in place, and both of my rear web frame long rails are going to get the same rabbet. All right, now with my pieces back on the assembly table, we can just double check with the orientation of these various pieces. This is our bottom web frame, and the back has the rabbet that's gonna face up. And then of course, I've got the 1/8 inch deep groove here at the front. And on the top piece, we've got the rabbet facing down and our groove facing down. And I mean, you could orient these however you want, but mine are essentially stacked in a way that you would position them in the final piece, right? That's all looking good. And now, let's talk about dominoes. For these, I'm gonna go with my 8x40s. We'll do 1 on the outer narrow boards, and we'll do 2 on the wider inner boards. The spacing on this is actually gonna be pretty simple. This is a 2-inch piece. We're gonna go centered at 1 inch, and we could set an adjustable square for that. And on these guys, we can actually just go in 1 inch from each side. And the way I'm gonna transfer those marks to these boards, obviously this one on the outside, we're gonna be flush on the outside. So that's 1 inch in, 1 inch in, that's pretty straightforward. For these, we wanna be about 16 inches in. So just gonna measure like so, put a mark at 16 inches, extend that to make it a little easier to see. And that is where this board starts. From that point, I could then transfer those 1 inch marks here. And the important thing is when you're actually making the domino mortise, to not confuse that first line with the other 2. That's just telling you where the board goes. These are the 2 that are telling you where the dominoes go. Now before I mark the rest of these, I just want to show you something you might consider. I don't think you need to do this on this particular project, but when you're using the domino, the more aids you can have to take your brain out of the equation, the better, because it's just so easy to put a domino in the wrong spot. So here's just a piece of scrap with a end piece on it. I cut this to 16 inches. So imagine if we have multiple, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 8 of these we need to line up these middle pieces with, right? So imagine 16 inches across this way. Instead of measuring every time, we just butt that guy up, and then we bring the wide cross rail in up against the stop, and then we transfer our lines, right? And we can do this on this piece as well. And then we can take it and flip it and do it on the far side too. And this way, each one of these gets more uniform, all right? So again, not absolutely critical, but if you think in these terms, this actually makes life easier, way easier when you're using the domino. Another thing you can think about is using it more like a story stick. Go a little bit longer. Then you just put a 16-inch mark, and you put your other 2 marks on there too. And now you've got something where you just butt it up, throw your line in, take the other side, throw the line in. That one That'll work too, you just gotta make sure your lines are perfectly square and fully wrapped around so that you can use this no matter what the orientation is. Again, you don't need it, but think in these terms with the domino and your life is gonna get a whole lot easier. Oh yeah! The Wood Whisperer Guild is an online school where you could take courses from some of the best instructors in the industry.
And so this is really good technique learning about reference faces.
If you're putting pressure on the bevel, you're going to cause problems and usually get that kind of vibration in the cut.
I'll be trying out a couple new techniques, new to me.
This plane doesn't flatten, this plane makes it pretty. This is a plane that flattens.
Whether you're new to woodworking or you're just trying to step up your game, the Guild offers top-notch video instruction that will guide you through every step of the build. And if you have trouble, we won't leave you hanging, since you can ask your instructor questions right on the website or discuss your project with your fellow Guild members in our various communities. With over 60 courses to choose from, you're sure to find something that piques your interest. The Wood Whisperer Guild, the next best thing to an in-person class. And once all the joinery is cut, I do recommend doing a dry assembly. You really just want to look for any major discrepancies, any mistakes you may have made. It's just remarkably easy with a domino to put a domino location or a mortise location in the wrong spot. Not that I've ever done that. I do it all the time. But do the dry assembly, look for the major stuff. Now, if you feel little discrepancies here and there, that's totally fine. It's just something that's going to happen, the natural variability. We could always sand that later. This is just looking for major things. Also, quick tip. This is another good time to glue those dominoes in place. So I would glue them into these smaller pieces, and this way they are pre-glued, ready to go, and when we do the final assembly, things are going to be a whole lot easier for us. All right, so next up, we've got to make a couple of panels and then make some grooves for those panels. Actually, we'll do the grooves first and then the panels. The panels are just in the bottom web frame. See, the top web frame is there just to kind of support the structure, and then when you look up, when you're sort of peeking into the inside, you're just going to see the underside of the main solid wood top. So no problems with those three openings. On the bottom, however, we do have a situation where you're going to slide that door over and see the inside compartment there, and you don't want a hole just showing the ground, right? So we're going to need a panel in there that is not only going to fill the space, but give us like a fairly flush fit so that it actually looks pretty good. And if you slide anything in on there, it's not going to get caught on anything. So to make those grooves, we're just going to mark with a pencil around the inside of the two outer holes. Now the middle one, totally up to you. If you want to put a panel there, absolutely you can, but just consider that it's only going to be a bank of drawers. There's no major benefit to it, but some people might see it as incomplete without it. You're more than welcome to. I don't feel the need to, so we're not going to do it. But let's mark inside here. I'm just going to use a pencil, and I'm going to mark a pencil line that just tells me which side is going to receive this groove. And this is going to save me a lot of confusion later. Okay, we'll do it on all four here. Then I'm going to take a finer pencil and I'm going to mark the ends of these cross rails in all four positions on each opening. That pencil line tells me where my workpiece ends, but it doesn't actually tell me the final location of the groove. The groove is going to go a 1/4 inch beyond that line. I just need to put the line there so that I can measure that 1/4 inch, and that tells me how far the bit is going to go. So I think I got all those. Let's move on to this guy. Same thing here. And then my dummy proofing mark. Now to make our grooves in these pieces, we're going to do kind of like we did before, just using a piece of scrap to help support the router. And fortunately, sometimes you get lucky, and you remember to not tear down your setups, right? This guy is actually set for that 1/4 inch distance that we had before, so I don't have to change anything here with my setup. Probably even my depth is set to where it needs to be, so we'll just double check that, but this actually should be fairly straightforward as we plow through these. just a quick note, you got to be careful here and make sure you're referencing from the same face. We always try to do that. So don't get these pieces mixed up. The way I'm doing this is any one that has the tape side, that's going to face out, and that's what I'm going to reference my edge guide off of. And this way, if this groove isn't dead center, it's not the end of the world, everything will be nice and consistent. So in some cases, like this one, I don't want my edge guide to get caught on this. I may have to take the piece of tape off temporarily or move it down, you know, a little bit lower just to get it out of the way. Now for the longer rails, I'm going to have to do it in sections, right? So we'll do one side and then reset up on the other side to do that one. And I also have to extend the line. So I've got my little pencil line here. There's my original line I drew. And now we could add a 1/4 inch to that. And I'll use white pencil here because this is a visual thing. I'm going to need to stop when I see it. And it's hard to see if it's not white. All right, so I'll do this anytime I have one of these lines. That's how I'm going to add the 1/4 inch. Now we're going to have to square these off just so that the panel, when we put it in there, doesn't get hung up on these corners. This is something normally I would do later, but man, this thing's already in the clamps. It's probably never going to be faster and easier than it is right now to just go into the corner right on that pencil line. There we go. One less thing to do later. Don't forget the 1/4 inch. All right, so with the grooves cut, I've got another dry assembly going here, and I have 2 clamps just snugging up these joints. I want to make sure I get an accurate representation of what this opening is. And I'm going to take a measurement and then simply add the groove depth. Now, because I use the same router setting, I have the same issue I had before. Not issue, it's actually an advantage, where my grooves are just a little bit over a 1/4 inch deep. So if I take a measurement like this, and let's say that distance is 14, then I add a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch, that puts me at 14.5. And I'm going to put a solid panel in here, so if I have that little bit of extra room in each of these grooves, that's perfect. So I can actually cut my panel to 14.5, knowing it's going to have a little bit of breathing room in there. So let's talk real quick about whether you should go solid or plywood here. Now, there's absolutely no reason you couldn't go with a 1/2 inch plywood, especially if you can get the walnut species if you're doing walnut. So whatever the species is of your project, if it can match, this is going to be visible when you open this thing up. So you wouldn't necessarily want to go with like a bee species and have a birch panel or something in there. Then again, maybe you like the way that looks. I don't want to tell you exactly what to do. I personally would want that to be walnut plywood. So if you have access to walnut plywood, you're going to need a 1/2 inch piece, enough to make both of these, and you'll be good to go. I'm going to continue with the theme of solid wood as much as possible in this project. I've actually got some walnut boards here that we milled for something else, and they wound up bowing a little bit, so we couldn't use them. And these are at a final thickness of 3/4 of an inch. So I don't feel so bad cutting that down now and then milling it down to 1/2 inch to create a 1/2 inch panel. And remember, this is one of those situations, just like the side panels, we're going to rabbet around the outside and end up with a nice flush surface here on the inside of this compartment. So I've got a few more of these boards. I'm just going to mill them down and make up a couple of nice little 1/2 inch panels. Trying to hold that one in. Woo. All right, so with the panels made, we can just kind of test the fit, and if you need to sneak up on it with a hand plane, a shoulder plane or something, totally fine. It's very similar to what we did with the legs. We're looking for a nice flush fit here on the top surface. On the bottom is where we're gonna see that recess, okay? Before I do a test fit though, I wanna double check something. The inside dividers here, these little rails, their position, this way or that way, isn't quite as critical. The outside ones, they are critical. And one of the reasons is because we're gonna be attaching this to our side sub-assembly. So we wanna make sure these are dead, straight, and square. And we also wanna make sure that they are positioned in a way that there's no extra material here, and I'll show you what I mean. So on this one, the domino is good, but it is not perfect. In some cases, it's just not, okay, maybe the domino is perfect, but the way that we use it isn't. I don't know how it happens, but sometimes you get a little discrepancy, and that's what I've got right here. I could feel this piece is sitting out just a little bit, and there's no room for movement because I used the tightest setting on the domino. So here's how we're gonna fix that. Pretty easy to do. Take this out. I know if I relieve a little bit of material off of this tenon here, we should be able to just nudge it that way a little bit. So that's what I'm gonna do. And dominoes have a little ridge on the outside there. Of course, the grain's not working in my favor today, which can happen. But that little ridge that's there just represents a little bit of extra material that you can knock down. And that might be just enough to make room so this guy can now slide a little too far even. We can make that perfectly flush. And that's something we'll perfect during the final glue up. We'll just make sure with glue on that we're tapping it back and forth, whichever way we need to make sure that that's nice and flush. Now that's also going to be important because if we were very careful with how we cut and made our joinery on our panel, we need to allow for wood movement. So if this rail is pushed in this way too far, that might actually eat up some of that wood movement area that we need, right? So super important that we are nice and flush on the outside edge. And I'll do that to all of these four corners here just to make sure before I even do this dry assembly. All right, so I want to show you something with the wood movement here in this panel. It's subtle, but it's super important because a lot of people don't realize when you have like a rabbeted panel like this, you need to have movement allowed for the entire thickness, not just what's in the groove, not just the portion that's sitting high. So let me show you what I mean, what you're aiming for. And if you don't have this yet, then go back to the tools and make sure you remove enough material that you see this. So I'm going to drop this panel into the groove in one of my bigger rails here. Okay, that's pretty good. And I'm going to knock the panel all the way over here and show you what I see on this side. There's a nice little gap right here. That gap right there shows me that I've got a gap for the tongue, and that's exactly what I need. We just want a little bit of extra room for movement right there. If you don't see a gap and there's no wiggle room, and watch, I'll tap it back to you, the gap is totally gone now. If you don't have that wiggle room, this panel is constricted. It's not going to be able to expand if it needs to. So that tells me that the tongue has a little bit of room to move. But what about the upper portion of this panel, that upper raised portion from the rabbet? That also needs to have a gap. Now the only way we're gonna see that is if we put our rails in place. So I'm gonna drop one in on this side. Make sure I'm nice and flush here. Let's get this big boy in there. Right now, when you look right here, you can see there's no gap. It actually is a pretty good grain match. It pretty much disappears, no gap, but there is a gap. It's on this side. So if you look right along this line here, we got a nice little gap that tells us we do still have some room to expand and contract. Now, if that's not enough, I mentioned this earlier, you can go back to the tools. Hopefully you still have the table saw set up. If you need a little bit more of a gap here, go ahead and just move the fence a little bit and widen that out. And same thing for the tongue. If you need a little bit more of a gap there, just get a block plane and go around and just kind of take a little bit of extra material out. You really do want this panel to have a little bit of room to float. All right, so I mentioned before that if you need to clean up some of these rabbets to get them to fit, you could use a hand tool to do that. I'll show you that process because I actually do have one here that is a little bit snug. And I think I could probably force it, but then I'm gonna probably damage this edge and lose that crisp edge. So the easiest way I know to do this is with a shoulder plane. So all we need is maybe a couple of passes here. That actually might be enough. Let's see if that's any better now. Look at that. That's all it took. Snug as a bug in a rug. All right, time to glue up our web frames. I'm going to start with the more complicated one, the bottom with the panels. Of course, the top one is going to be the same thing, just without the panels. I'm not going to overdo the glue because I don't want the glue to get into the grooves where the panels are. I don't want to immobilize these solid panels. I want to make sure that they can kind of float. And I also want to make sure that everything stays square, because think about it this way. This is a very important part of the internal construction. If something here is out of square, then we go and bring our sides into this whole thing and have sliding doors on the front. We can't afford to be skewed, so we're going to make sure, and I've got my big square over here to make sure that this whole assembly, when it's all said and done, both of these ends are nice and square to the front. Right, so let's start by putting some glue in the mortises. Now, here's a little cheat that you can do, especially on something like a web frame that's going to be captured inside of a case. You don't need to go nuts with the glue. So what I'm going to do is really just put a generous amount of glue into each mortise. You don't actually have to put the glue on the tenon. Now, I think if you have the time, and I'm a little bit concerned about like making sure we have enough time to do this, you would have no problem, you know, putting the glue on the tenons too. But in a case like this, I just think there's so much going on holding these web frames in place, we really don't need to get crazy about it. And whatever glue gets onto that tenon, by inserting it into a glued mortise, will be totally fine. It also makes this whole process a lot faster. It means, you know, I'll have a little bit more time to wiggle the pieces around to get them square. And of course, having already pre-glued the tenons into these pieces saves me a bunch of time too. Now, it certainly doesn't hurt to get a little glue onto this here, even though that's an end grain connection. It still adds value to the strength of the joint, and it's easy enough to do. I know somebody's gonna freak out because I'm not putting glue on the tenons, but it's gonna be fine, trust me. So no glue at all on these panels. Pop my rails in. Try to get them pretty close. There we go. Next panel. And now for the little rail, the rear rail. I like to start on one end and work my way across. And real subtle thing, you may have noticed I moved to my workbench for this. My assembly table, perfectly sturdy, it does a fine job, but there isn't a lot of direct connection from the top to the legs to the floor unless you're right on a rail. So when I do these hammer hits with something like this, you can kind of feel a little bit of a bounce back. Your hits are a lot less effective. So I like to do something like this at the workbench, which is a real nice sturdy connection to the ground. All right, so I'm gonna feel my ends here. Anything that is a little bit uneven, if I can tap it in place, I will. Oh yeah, just make sure I close this up. And now we're gonna check everything for square. If you don't have a giant square, you can use whatever square you have, just get it close. It's looking good. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Okay, let's get a couple more clamps on there. We can call this bad boy done. Don't want a whole lot of clamping pressure, just enough to bring those joints closed. Any more than that, you may wind up warping this whole thing, and we definitely do not want that. Put a clamp over each divider. Okay, I'll let that sit. All right, so the glue is dry, and now I'm just evaluating the final fit. If there's any discrepancies in the surface, there's really only a couple places you need to be worried about, whether the surfaces are at the same level. Here and here, we're gonna have dividers connecting with some sliding dovetails. So if we don't have a nice flat surface between the front and back rail and this piece here, that could be problematic because it could create not only problems with the routing process, but also gaps. So if you set a straight edge down there and you see a little bit of daylight under there, then you might want to fix that. If it's sunken in, that is kind of the worst case scenario, because then you can't really do much about that. I don't want to see you touching these surfaces. But then again, the visible portion of that joint is going to be out here anyway. So if this was just sunken by a little bit and you had a little gap there, probably wouldn't make a huge difference. So I do have a very, very slight amount of material here that I need to level that out with, and you could just sand it, but sanding is a little bit inexact, and I really want this to be nice and flat because I'm going to have to do joinery on there. So I'm going to use my jack plane and just take a few passes and see if we can't get that a little bit more leveled out. That's about all it's going to take. And now I'll just give everything a nice little sanding. Next time on The Wood Whisperer, you certainly could use another tool. You could use the bandsaw, clean it up with a hand plane, no problems there whatsoever. The legs can sustain a deeper domino. So again, gets confusing, but I think it's totally worth it to do it.